Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this session of three-dimensional unit planning. My name is Svea Anderson. I am the ASTA ambassador and host for today's webinar. This webinar will be recorded. I'll be assisting the presenters by watching the chat box and answering any technical questions. The chat box can be found at the bottom of your screen. Our presenter today is Leslie Horn from Higley School District. During the past year, 60 middle level teachers participated in Arizona Science Teachers Association's intense professional learning program called the Deeper Dive, constructing three-dimensional units. Teachers worked in professional learning communities where they learned how to utilize 5 tools and processes for implementing the NGSS. The ASTA, along with BSCS and the ADE, facilitated the training. With the new science standards the AZSS adopted, teachers learned how to create instructional units that implemented the 3 major dimensions: the science and engineering practices, or SEPs, the cross-cutting concepts, or CCCs, and core ideas: physical science, life science, and earth-space science. These dimensions, along with major instructional shifts presented by the standards, are new and challenging for educators. One conceptual shift with the new standards requires teachers to move their instruction from fact-based to understanding phenomena. As you know, students currently learn scientific facts, but are often not able to explain the importance of these facts and their interconnections to the world around them. To build capacity amongst the Arizona teachers in developing and implementing the 3-dimensional instructional units, the Deeper Dive program had the following objectives: to build capacity through collaboration with science leaders statewide, to learn to use tools that translate science concepts, practices, and performance expectations into instructional sequences that form a 3-dimensional science instructional unit, to think deeply about learning and teaching to develop a clear vision of science education that's coherent and focused and rigorous and based on the 3-dimensional best practices as outlined in the framework for K-12 science education, and to collaboratively align instructional units to the Arizona Science Standards and share them throughout the state. The ASTA is delighted to have Leslie Horn today from Higley share her unit that she's developed with you. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my share, Leslie, and you can take over.
Fabulous, thank you. Well, I just want to say welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you are here. This training that I was involved in the past year was one of the best trainings I've had, and I love to share it and I love to use it. So I'm happy to answer any questions before, after, or during the presentation. So welcome again. My name is Leslie Horn. I worked with several other teachers in our school district to create a 6th grade life unit. And today I'm going to be using that life unit as an example as we go through creating the blueprints. So in the process that we went through, one of the first things we did was tool 1, which is creating our unit blueprint. And it's really the base, the foundation of creating that 3-dimensional science unit. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So again, for today, any questions or comments, please utilize the chat bar. Our goals will be to deepen understanding of the Arizona Science Standards, increase abilities to plan for coherent 3-dimensional instruction, and lay the foundation for the design of a unit of instruction and assessment. We will do this through going through the steps to create a blueprint. I will then go through the steps again with an example, so you can understand more about what each step entails, and then we'll have questions at the end for any of questions that you arise during the process. So to begin with, we want to emphasize the fact that we are focusing on the 3-dimensional standards that came from the framework of K-12 science education. And it is important to understand that these 3-dimensional dimensions play a key role in the new science assessments and standards for Arizona. So in creating a unit blueprint, we have 8 steps, or at least I've transferred what we did with Tool 1 into 8 steps to break it down into easy. When we have a process, we have steps. It's a lot easier to do one thing at a time and not be overwhelmed with the whole entity of the task, which this process can be overwhelming. So anytime you endeavor in it and start new with it, please remember to take deep breaths, go one step at a time, and don't let it overwhelm you, because you can always do it in the little steps and not think about the end until you get there. So again, there's going to be 8 steps. Let's go through those. So we're going to read your research first and foremost. So every discipline has some research that is found in the 2 documents that are most important for us. And you want to start by reading those. So you want to look into those research documents. The first one we work with is Working with the Big Ideas of Science Education. This is the document that the Arizona core ideas are mostly based on for knowing and using science. And this is going to be also come back to during steps 2 and 6. But step 1 is to read this document. It's a fairly easy read, not too difficult with that. The second document you want to look at is the Framework for K-12 Science Education. You will be using this document for steps 4 through 6. The research discusses the use of the 3 dimensions and will help you understand the science engineering practices and the cross-cutting concepts, which we call the SCPs and the CCCs. Again, this one is a little more hefty of a read, but breaking it down and focusing on the first, I believe, 4 chapters is a good way to start. And it's not a difficult read. There's just more to it than in the big ideas. But again, you want to start with these readings to become familiar with what 3-dimensional science teaching and learning is before you move on. Step 2 is to break apart the big core ideas of science into smaller chunks. So at this point, you want to decide what unit you want to kind of work on. So in our example, we're focusing on 6th grade life. So we're going to look at life, the core ideas within the life discipline. So you're going to pull out the different sections of the core ideas for knowing science from the research document, Working with the Big Ideas of Science Education. And these are on pages 20 to 29. So you're going to pull out for your age group and your discipline those specific pages. You're going to then organize the chunks in a way you would teach. So essentially, you're going to take the sentences or the core ideas in an instructional sequence that makes sense to you. So you're going to pull them out and then put them kind of in an order that makes sense for you to present to your students in a timeline. Step 4 is to layer in a standard. You're then going to match the core idea with the appropriate Arizona science standard at the appropriate grade level. So for 6th grade, we're going to look in 6th grade life, and we're going to match up the core idea with which standard it best represents under. Ideally, you're going to have several core ideas meshed together with a standard or multiple standards and multiple ideas to bundle together. Don't bundle what doesn't make sense, but bundle what does make sense so that you're not doing everything individually. The next step is to layer in the science and engineering practices. So you're going to identify one or more science and engineering practice element to use with your standard and core idea. And remember, for your science and engineering practice, you need to match what is in the standard. So the standard will start with a STEM, and that STEM should match a science and engineering practice. And then your job is then to find an element which would go with that standard. And the elements are found in the K-12 Science and Engineering Progress Matrix of Elements. You do not want to include too many SCPs, because every SCP you include in your learning sequence, you will be assessing. So you don't want to overwhelm yourself or your student by testing too many items. Step 6 is to layer in the cross-cutting concepts. And just like the SCPs or the science and engineering practices, the CCCs have elements that you're going to use with your standard. Unlike the SCPs, however, you get to pick which cross-cutting concept you would like to incorporate in your unit. There is no designation from the state that you pick a certain one. There are, however, standards or cross-cutting concepts, excuse me, that are highly suggested in grades K through 8. And in the standards document, you can see those bolded. Most likely, you're going to end up picking a cross-cutting concept that is bolded anyway, because that's what makes logical sense to go with your topic. But you are not required to, nor do you have to stick to only that one. So often I would pick one that was kind of bolded and then add a secondary that we felt went with our unit well. Again, the cross-cutting elements can be found on the cross-cutting progression matrix of elements under the vertical progressions website on the Arizona Science Standards webpage. Step 7, you're going to layer in the core idea for using science. So this is, again, where you're going to identify an element for the core ideas for using science. These are going to be found on pages 30 to 33 of Working with Big Ideas of Science. Remember, there's 2 types of core ideas, those of knowing science and those of using science. So here we're talking about the using science. How are we going to use the science? There's 3, U1, U2, and U3. Step 8 is to summarize each learning sequence. We're going to lay all the pieces out from steps 1 through 6. Our example shows in the column, which you will see shortly, and then summarize the science learning for all to piece together. What is the big idea? You're going to write out the summary and add it to the bottom or the top of the sequence. So as you can see here, you're going to have all the steps. Now, this does not have to be done on cards. It can be done in a computer, in an Excel document, in a Word document, however you best work. I personally am very tactile, so using the cards was very helpful for me. So now we are going to take all 8 steps and we're going to break it down using an example so that you can see what it might look like with your content or something similar to your content. We are going to use the 6th grade life science unit that my group created for the deeper dive. And this picture shows the blueprint using cards of the entire set. So this is everything we are doing for life science in 6th grade. It has 4 instructional sequences. So each column is equivalent to an instructional sequence in which you're going to do steps 1 through 8 for each column. This is a picture of one instructional sequence found in the 6th grade. So we're going to look at it step by step. Each color essentially represents a step. Step 1, again, we're going to start with the research documents. It's so important to understand what it is the expectation is for students to learn. And it's also important to know what comes before your grade level and what comes after your grade level. So you want to start with looking at the documents as a whole, just in general. Summarize, quick read. Don't feel like you have to study in depth at this time. Just kind of understand how the documents are set up and what they cover. After your initial read of the documents, you're going to reread what is needed for your unit. So every time you start a new unit, you want to reread because it helps jog everything in your memory, and you want to make sure you understand because it's important to know where the grade levels before you ended, what's expected of you, and what the grade levels after you are looking at. So for us, we reread Life Science number 8 for middle school students. In the document, you will notice there are numbers on the side. Those indicate age levels. Because it's kind of in Britain, it was a British document, it doesn't match our grade levels. So these are ages. So we in middle school are looking at 11 to 14. So this is the time period in which we're focused on. But notice I can read the section above for those grade levels that are before me, and then the grade levels after me are underneath. So you're able to focus on what exactly you need the students to be able to accomplish within that content. Then you're going to read your SEP for, in this case, the developing and using models out of the framework research document. And then you're also going to do your cross-cutting concepts, looking for those cross-cutting concepts which may most apply for your content and your standard. Step 2 is to break all of these ideas that are in your core ideas into smaller chunks, because you're not going to teach that entire paragraph to the students all at the same time. You're going to break it up into little pieces. So how would you break that up? And what pieces would you put together? Because sometimes what they list in the first sentence might get taught really well with what's in the last sentence. So you might put those together. So you're going to break all of those apart into what I use as cards, but you could also do it again in an Excel or Word document if you so choose. Continuation of step 2, we ended up with 13 different segments for 6th grade life science. We ended up modifying a few of them throughout the process, and that's fine. What you can do is you can cross through and highlight to indicate this card is talking about this, and this card is focused on this. So for instance, on one card, we crossed out the first sentence, and on a duplicate card, we crossed out the second sentence. So we still had the first sentence and second sentence represented, but we had used highlighters and cross out marks to indicate which one we were going to focus on at that moment. Step 3, the next step is to take all those core ideas or cards and organize them in a unit flow. So you want to put them in the order that makes sense to you to teach to students. If they should be taught in the same set of lessons, then you're going to stack them together like the ones we did in the picture. So in the picture, we decided all of those should be kind of in the same set of lessons for the students. So we're bundling them together. In that instance, I like to think, would this be on a quiz together? If I would put it on a quiz together, I'm going to bundle it together. If I'm not sure I'm going to put it on a quiz together, then I might keep it separate until later down in the process, and I might decide to put it together then. You can always make modifications and changes during this process, and it's actually expected that you will. Because when you start, you think one thing, and by the time you're done, you realize sometimes you make realizations that make you want to change things and rearrange, and that's okay. This is a working document, especially at the beginning. Continuation for step 3, you're going to take all the core ideas and organize them in a unit flow. So what would you teach together in the same lesson? Those are in a column. What topics would come first, second, and third? Those go from left to right in a sequence. So in this instance, the far left column, those would be taught in lessons together. Then in a separate set of lessons, the second column would be taught together. Then in a separate set of lessons, then in a separate set of lessons. So essentially in front of you, what you see are 4 learning sequences. Now, sometimes the cards can be duplicated in columns or broken down into smaller chunks. So feel free to duplicate cards and focus on a topic multiple times, or only do half of it in this one, half of it in the other one. That is completely up to you as you're designing your blueprint. So for steps 2 and 3, we broke down the core ideas for knowing science to create the cards. For steps 4 and 8, we focus on one column of the core ideas for knowing science. This is an instructional sequence so we're going to focus on it at a time. So the last slide, we had 4 columns. Now we're going to take that first column and focus only on it. For steps 4 through 8, we're going to do all the steps, and then we'll repeat with the second column, and then repeat with the third column, and then repeat for the fourth column. So step 4 with that first column is you're going to add in you're going to match the core ideas from step 3 with the appropriate Arizona Science Standard at the appropriate grade level. So here is when you're going to add in your standard with the core ideas. And again, you can bundle. You're going to layer in the standards. So in our example, we have the standard develop and use models to demonstrate interdependence of organisms and their environment, including biotic and abiotic factors. So that standard went well with this learning sequence. So we're going to put that standard with it at the top. You do not have to stick with just one standard. If more than one standard fits a learning sequence, that is fine. Just note whether or not there's 1 or 2 science and engineering practices, because that will become important later. Again, you can bundle it more than one card. You can also repeat standards in other sequences. Sometimes the sequences, to cover a standard, you need 2 or more sequences. And so that card may be repeated in another sequence, and that is also okay. So you can see in this example, we have more than one standard in the 4th instructional sequence. And then in the 2nd and 3rd instructional sequence, we repeated standards. So we have the same thing for those 2 learning sequences, but there was so much content that we divided into 2 sections. In labeling or in matching your standard, you want to pay attention to the SAP, which is that STEM. So develop and use models. So for step 5, we want to layer in the science and engineering practice. So we go back to the standard, we look at the STEM, we then go to the K-12 science and engineering progress matrix of elements, which you can find on the state website under the standards tab. The science and engineering practice, you want to find that page, and then you want to identify which element you want to focus on. So under 6th and 8th grade, all of these were modeling elements that are bulleted. We decided to focus on the first one, and we kind of summarized it a little bit because it's kind of big. So sometimes if they're big like this, you can pull out what you're doing for the elements. Okay, so we pulled that one, and that's what we put on our card for that first instructional sequence. Remember, you don't want to put too many different SEPs in your learning sequence because you will be assessing them. So we stuck to, for the most part, no more than 2 different SEPs because that seemed realistic for us to teach together and to assess together. Step 6, that's when you're adding the cross-cutting concept. That is going to be very similar in process as the SEP. The only difference is you are not instructed to be which cross-cutting concept you have to include. But you're going to go through the same process. You're going to find the matrix of elements. You're going to figure out which one. And so this will take more reading because you may want to read through all the elements for all of the cross-cutting concepts for your grade band and kind of pull out the ones that you feel fit the core ideas and the SEP that you're looking at. So in this case, we picked 2 different cross-cutting concepts. We have cause and effect and stability and change. And then the elements are found as under the bulleted list. And again, K-8 does have highly suggested topics like patterns or cause and effect tend to pop up quite often. Step 7 is to layer in the core idea for using science. So to identify an element for using science, you're going to go back to the first research document, and on pages 30 to 33, you're going to find your grade level, or your age level, I should say, section, and those are kind of what you're going to split apart into elements. So for this unit, we picked the element careful and systematic observations and accurate descriptions of what is observed are fundamentals to scientific investigation. Now, we are dictated by the standard which U to use. We either use U1, U2, or U3. So in this case, we have U1, which is covered, I believe, by number 11 and 12 in the research documents, pages 30 to 33. The last step is to summarize each learning sequence. So you're going to read over your learning sequence and figure out what is the big idea. Kind of wordsmith it once you get it down. Ours has not been wordsmithed yet, but it was wordsmithed by the time we got to the actual big idea. And then you can either put it at the top, or in our case, in the actual electronic document, we put it at the bottom. So you're reading through the standard, the core ideas, the science and engineering practice, the cross-cutting concepts, the using science, and then it comes to our big idea. So it's basically just a summarization of what's going on. Then you're going to rinse and repeat. You're going to take the second learning sequence and you're going to go back to step 4 and go through step 8. Then you're going to go to learning sequence number 3 and do the same. until all of your learning sequence have had step 1 through 8 completed. This is a picture of what our life 6th grade section came out to be. So we have our summary at the top here, and then red standards with pink, and then orange core ideas. We have our cross-cutting concepts, which you can't see in this first column so much. Oh, those are orange, they're right here. So you're gonna put the left picture on top of the right picture, and it kind of did that long thing. You can, again, do this in cards, you can do it on an Excel doc or a Word doc, or whatever you want to use. So now's the time for questions if you have any. If there's no questions, I just want to emphasize the fact I have included the documents to use in the process, so the Arizona Science Standards. And most of these can be found off of the Arizona Department of Ed Arizona Science webpage for curriculum. The framework for K-12 science education, it's a free download. So when you Google search, it'll be on the right. Working with the big ideas of science education is, again, a free download. And then vertical progressions of cross-cutting and science and engineering practices, those again are on the state website. Resources to support the process would be, again, the standards website. BSCS Science Learning has examples of all the tools. And then the 5 tools and processes for translating NGSS into instruction and classroom assessment, which is off of the BSCS. I want to thank you for listening and attending our session today, and please contact me if you have any questions.
That was awesome. Thank you, Leslie. So we've reached the end of our time for today, but I really want to thank Leslie. That was so informative and so well laid out and so organized. That was incredible. So thank you. Again, she's from Higley, and knowing that our new science standards require teachers to shift the way they think, we're really appreciative of you sharing these 8 steps in order to go through the process. So thank you.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. So thank you everyone who joined us today. The ASTA has many other exciting learning experiences coming up, and I hope you'll check out the website to learn more. Awesome. Thank you again for joining us. Have a good day.
Bye.
Leslie, can you hit stop record?
I don't see it. Oh, there it is.
Awesome. Thank you.